Hello, everybody. Welcome to our class. A quick introduction before we get started. My name is Ian Joyner. I'm a concept artist working in the film industry. Been working in the industry for about a little over 15 years now. In that time, I've primarily focused on creatures and characters and everything that's kind of involved with that. Costumes, props, keyframes, and really problem solving for VFX and for live action. I've done a lot of things in full makeups, all the way to VFX characters to simple costumes. And in this class, I'd like to kind of cover designing a creature who's also a character, or as I'm calling it, a creature with character. The idea here is going to be that this character and creature is not just a bloodthirsty monster out for our protagonist's blood, but that there's actually more to it. Perhaps as the story goes on, this character could develop or become an ally. So we're going to be doing a kind of a space pirate bounty hunter style thing, the kind of thing you'd see in Guardians of the Galaxy, the kind of thing you might see in Star Wars. And we're going to have a little bit of a retro styling. We're going to have a little bit of fun with it and try to have a little personality as well as hopefully come up with a pretty fun design. So I want to talk a little bit, especially in the introduction, about the role of a concept artist today. Oftentimes, we are asked to do a lot of designs very quickly. Yet, we're also asked to have something that looks just as real as you can imagine, so that the directors, producers, production designers can imagine seeing it on screen with our live action heroes. So before we can get started even imagining that, we have to kind of know what we're going to be making. So I wrote up this little synopsis here. And the idea will be that we're going to be making a space pirate bounty hunter type character, kind of a classic trope that you've seen in a lot of movies and you'll see in a lot more. I like the idea of him being older, but not frail, more of a, he's been around, he's seen it all. I want to have some retro kind of style to the costume, but not be too much of a throwback. Just maybe not overly sci-fi, something that's a little more recognizable. I also want to make sure that from a distance that we'd have an interesting silhouette, so breaking the human form just a bit, and yet still being recognizable. Some form of weapon, and this won't be a simple makeup applied to an actor, but probably a fully CG character. In this day and age, sometimes you'll do a makeup design and then they'll augment it. Sometimes it will be just a person wearing a complete mocap suit on set. But the idea for this character, too, is that he needs to be able to emote. So he's not just a scary monster, but he might have some humorous moments. He might have some pathos to him. So that will be our goal as we get going. Before we get into the actual process of gathering reference, I want to talk about a really important part, and that is actually managing your reference. In the past, I've had folders or maybe a Photoshop document full of all the reference I find, but recently I came across this program called PureRef, so I'm going to give them a free plug. This program is completely free, and you can support them by donating some money if you like it as much as I do. They have the ability to copy and paste from the web or from your desktop, drag and drop, import, you name it, it can do it. Also, quick rescaling, organization, dynamic canvas, so as you add more things to it, the bigger it gets. And as just the importance of keeping your reference in one easy-to-find place, I can't recommend it enough. With that being said, let's talk about what goes into actually gathering the reference for a character. I have a rough idea of what I want the character to be: humanoid, recognizable yet distinctly alien. And what I decided to go to almost every time is nature. Nature is the ultimate creature designer, so I begin finding things that kind of speak to me a little bit on this level. The deep ocean is always a wonderful place to find a variety of strange and unique life forms. And yet, as humans, we're able to recognize certain traits on these creatures. Some look happy, some look angry. And by kind of zoning in on these features, we start to develop an eye on how we can maybe combine some of these creatures, how we can pull influence from them, and how we can evolve them into our own unique designs. So I love the fact of how varied some of the facial features are on these animals. You can see eyes and nose, recognizable landmarks, and yet they're done in such different and unique ways. One of the things that really speaks to me is the simplicity of the form of something like a hippo, or the elongated faces on these apes. When we start sculpting, we're going to really be thinking about things called primary forms, or the base structure of what makes our character. And all of these have a pretty unique take on that. So knowing that I wanted something humanoid yet distinctly alien, I knew I didn't want to go into insects, because very quickly they go into unrecognizable or unempathetic. And that's not what we're looking for this character. I want something that, as we learn more about him, he may start to have a whole different side to him. And it can be a little tricky if you lean into the insectoid too much. The ocean creatures have just such a variety of shapes and colors and surfaces and textures that there's so much we can pull from just a few images. And early on, I really liked the idea of doing a kind of Dr. Zoidberg style octopus guy, but knowing the need for this project, I figured that was probably not the way to go. So all of these were kind of gathered while I was sketching and also before sketching. And I keep growing my reference as I need it. But some of the things that stood out to me were something like the cheekbones on this warthog. The eyes on it too. I like the detail from areas of rest to all of a sudden the very detailed around the eyes or in areas of movement. And if we look at the actual skull structure of one of these animals, there's some great influence there too. In fact, if you look at skulls of creatures and you can almost start to interpret whole faces on there. The big eyes, this is the top of a bird head, but look at the little mouth, eyes. This could be a front view of an alien. A fun trick is sometimes to take these things and do mirror features or whatever in Photoshop or whatever program you prefer, and you'll start to discover new shapes that you might not have thought of. In terms of humanity, nothing beats, well, humans first, but after that, apes, our closest cousins. I love the detail on this bat's ears. I thought those were really interesting. I also like the way that the smoothness of the horn went into this kind of bony mass and then into the fleshiness of the face on the water buffalo. All of that will make a very interesting character if we apply it in a new way. As a creature designer, you're honestly gathering a lot of information and mixing and matching it in your own unique fashion. Another trait that I kept trying to pull back to was the beluga whale's kind of bulge that it has on the top of its head. I love the texturing and some of the personality that these snails have, which is strange to say considering their faces are almost unrecognizable, yet they feel like little bunnies or something. Speaking of going too far from humanity, you have these microorganisms, which are so very alien already, but there are moments on there that we may look at in terms of our design. So that's a lot of the animals I was looking at before I began sketching and during. And when we get to the sketching process, you'll see a lot of these influences are pulled into that. In terms of styling, I want to talk about that. So mood-wise, I looked at a few movies. The Man with No Name, Clint Eastwood, the quintessential bounty hunter. I love the fact that he looks like he's been around for a long time, yet still strong. Same with something like Hugh Jackman in Logan. His beat-up visage was just very inspirational in terms of where we might take this character. In terms of costuming, I like this kind of utilitarian take on the sci-fi armor as well. So some elements of that were brought in. One of my favorite movies of all time is Alien, and the costumes, the spacesuits are, to this day, I think, one of the strongest spacesuit designs. I love the bulkiness. I love the textural changes. All of it just instantly tells a story, and that's what we're aiming for. Speaking of story, nothing spoke more to me as a kid than Mos Eisley Cantina or Jabba's Palace. The camera would pan by a galaxy's worth of characters and never linger on them for more than a second, but every single one of them begged to have their story told. And I'm pretty sure that because of these movies, I do what I do. In fact, one of the most iconic scenes in Empire Strikes Back was the bounty hunters on the bridge. And one character in particular stood out so much that to this day, he's almost the definition of cool in those movies, despite only having about 5 lines. Another later movie that I really loved was Men in Black. And I thought the creature designers and sculptors and everybody involved did such a wonderful job of adding so much character to these very alien creatures. Even without costuming, each one tells a story. And not a slam on these characters, but one thing I don't want to have is just the feeling of a prosthetic on a human face. Sometimes that's a very necessary thing, but I'm looking more for the fully alien kind of take. That this could be beyond just a makeup. It'll be a digital character or an augmented prosthetic. And humans themselves are something you can't have enough reference on. We're going to be fusing animal anatomy with the human, so finding some character here that I really wanted to instill on our guy was of the utmost importance. The gauntness of a face, the weathered look, the distance between the neck to the trap to the skull, or just the actual personality behind the eyes. I'd like to talk a little bit about sketching and kind of how I use it in my process. Sometimes I'll take a drawing to a fairly nice point, and sometimes I'll just do little tiny doodles for myself. For this project, I mostly just did little sketches because I knew I was going to be able to develop the character that I wanted in 3D. But I do want to talk a little bit about the importance of sketching. So 2D is always a faster process. You can generate a whole lot of ideas in a fraction of the time that it would take you to do if you were working in 3D. So when I first began this project, I knew I wanted to do a bust. I wasn't sure of what, but I did this very small little sketch here. It's probably about the size of my thumb with all 3 of these guys in just while I was working. And at first I thought maybe making a demon-y kind of guy, but that didn't seem to give me many opportunities to explore costuming. And then I kind of sketched out the more alien fun design here, which was kind of referencing that boar with the cheekbones. And along with this little guy here who was referencing those water buffaloes and some of the insects and all sorts of stuff. So initial couple minutes of drawing, and I had something in there that I thought was interesting and could be fun to explore more. But I wasn't sold yet. So the next thing I did was a couple different types of alien bodies that still kind of felt like they might be fun to work on. One was kind of a traditional hammerhead shape. The other one was a squat, more of a kind of, looks more like an engineer, honestly, when I look at him, but referencing mole rats and ants and something a little bit different than what you might expect. But neither one of these really was grabbing my attention either. And then I did a kind of a fishman type thing. The only through line I had was this kind of mustache, tentacle mustache feeling idea that seemed to keep showing up in my sketches. So it was something that I obviously had on the brain. I then moved on and did this sketch, but it felt a little too regal, a little too evil, which is not the intention that I was going for. And so scrapped that idea. But there was still something there that I thought could be fun. I liked the nostril being up high, a strange head shape, and again, that tentacled mustache. And so speaking about tentacles, I knew I really wanted to spend some time exploring the octopus idea. I knew early on it probably wasn't going to achieve the goal I was looking for, but I also thought it was worth exploring. It ended up being a little too silly looking and still would be fun to sculpt one day, but definitely kind of just slapping a squid on top of a body is not exactly what I wanted to do for this character. So I tried to add a little bit more of a humanity to it, as well as starting to just kind of think about the costume. I wasn't too worried about it, and I also wasn't sure how far I wanted to take the bust itself. If it was just going to go to the chest, it may just go to the collar. I wasn't quite sure. But there were some beats here I liked. I like kind of the exposed ear area, maybe really pronouncing that and making a bit of a evolutionary function. I then did a quick sketch of trying to add a little bit more sinister feel to that octopus idea. And I actually liked this idea. It's something I might still want to go back to and visit. It just looks like fun to sculpt. But I also thought it didn't really give me the humanity that we were kind of going for on this character. So moving on from that, I had a very small thumbnail of this crescent moon shape thing. Honestly, it wasn't even really intended for this project. It was just some weird shape I was drawing while taking notes. But I thought there was something fun about it. The spidery kind of eye arrangement I thought might be interesting, but I also knew early on this was going to be very problematic in trying to develop something that you could relate to and empathize with, but still kind of fun to explore. After that, I took that and tried to maybe simplify it into something a little easier to deal with, but ended up losing a little bit of the edge that the other ones had, which led to this little drawing here, which kind of incorporated a lot of the ideas that we had seen earlier. After that, I did these two characters, still playing in that world. I thought maybe going a little more simian with the face could be something to explore. And I like the idea of him having a big, tough buddy who's maybe not so intelligent. And we're going to do a quick version of him as a ZBrush crash course. And then lastly, I just did a little bit of an attitude sketch and a little bit more resolved head. But I also knew I was going to explore this so much in 3D. I didn't want to spend a lot of time in the drawing stage as it was really just for myself. But, you know, in just a very short amount of time, I was able to get a lot of different ideas and get some direction in my head of where I wanted to go. It's easy when you start in 3D to kind of lose sight of what you're trying to make and just spiral off into infinite variation. So having a little bit of an idea before you get started is really important, in my opinion. So ZBrush. This class is not intended to be a introductory course to ZBrush. I want this to be, hopefully you guys have some knowledge, and if you don't have the knowledge, hopefully it kind of excites you and makes you want to learn a little bit about these tools. Beyond Photoshop, ZBrush is probably the next most powerful thing you're going to have in design. The differences of doing a 2D design and a 3D design are pretty major, and one of the things with 3D is that it's kind of a lot slower. So I wanted to kind of take you through some of these tools before we jump into the next chapters, where we're going to speed things up pretty drastically and jump ahead because it becomes very repetitive. So a few little things. I've docked my the little range thing down here to turn it off and on. I have some brush mask settings here, backface masking and topological. I have my brushes down below there, you can see. We'll talk about those in a moment. So when we're going to start something, unless I'm doing a makeup where it's going to be like on top of a human head or an actor, I usually start with a sphere and just start to kind of sculpt in form. And sometimes I won't even do a 2D sketch. I'll just jump right into 3D. So I'm going to make a Dynamesh out of this. And Dynamesh is kind of like digital clay. It's very destructive. It has the ability to kind of go anywhere you want it to go. It's pretty wonderful. But a common flaw people do is when they're working in Dynamesh that they jump into a high resolution so they can get that nice detail really fast. And that's not something that I ever recommend. Early stages, not just because you shouldn't be focusing on detail early, but because ZBrush gets slower and slower the higher resolution you go. So I've made this a very low resolution, 16, and it's all dependent on the scale of your object. So by using just the default ZBrush sphere, it's pretty predictable in terms of how it works. And a fun trick that you guys might not know in ZBrush, if you do use it, is by holding Control on either the gizmo's white little corners or on the middle of your transpose line, you can extrude. You extrude the polygons you have masked off or duplicate. So holding Control and just rotating. I really love this new gizmo. It's kind of a newer feature, newish, and it just gives a little bit nicer directionality so you really can see where you're going. So I'm just blocking out the main forms here. So we have a neck and a torso. And right now I haven't applied the Dynamesh, so that's why you see these long, stretchy out polygons. But once we apply it, you can see it all evens out. What's good about this is that we're sculpting, you don't want to have one area that's very dense in polygons where you can add a lot of detail and other areas that have like 2 or 3, so you just have no fidelity in those areas. So working low res in Dynamesh lets us really control that. So when you're working on a character, there's 2 ways I usually start. One is going to be doing the sketches as you see, and I might even take them pretty far. I might even take them to a rough painting before I commit to a ZBrush sculpt. The other way is I'll just jump right into ZBrush and start finding the forms. It depends on the character and creature. When I'm doing just straight up creature design, I actually find the ZBrush method to be very versatile. But when I'm doing something with more costume and maybe it's on a human, 2D is really the way I like to work early on. So you can see here is I was just playing with the Sculptris Pro method. And what that is a relatively new feature that allows you to dynamically add detail to the areas you're sculpting. The problem is that when you're working on it, it can, if you're still figuring out your main forms and you apply Dynamesh to it, it'll just wash away that detail. So that's something I would only do later on in the process. So just referencing back to the design that I'm trying to block out here. And another thing I would like to point out at this stage, and you're going to notice it in the next few chapters also, the move brush is the workhorse, especially at these early stages. In fact, I don't know that up until this point I've even used another brush. I might mask some things out or smooth some things out, but generally I am just using the move brush. It's like using your fingers and pulling out the forms of clay. So I'm just trying to get the general gesture before I commit to anything. So I'm still very low resolution in Dynamesh, and I will not step this up until this step is kind of completed, and I feel that I can add no more to this level. Which does bring up another point. When you're working in the industry, you never know when people are going to need something. They might tell you you have a week, and before you know it, they've contacted you by the end of the day and said, so send us what you got. We got to show it to them. So one of the harder parts of working in 3D is that the early stages are kind of hard to see where the end stages will result. When you do a sketch, the roughest kind of gesture tells more of a story very early on, and then you can start to add more and more fidelity to it. So when I'm working in 3D, I kind of keep that in mind too, and I'll usually focus on the head first. I'll block out the whole body as well, but I will then go back into the head and make it something that if someone walked by my desk and needed to see something, they could go, oh yeah, I see where that's going, cool, or oh no, that's going the wrong direction, as sooner rather than later. And honestly, a lot of time it's for myself too, while I'm doing that. So we're just starting to use some of the other brushes. This is just the standard brush. Damn Standard and Standard are very similar. Standard, as you can see, kind of adds this little additive or subtractive area, and the Damn Standard is more of like a little crease, a little pinchy kind of thing. Both of them are really useful, and I love using like the Damn Standard to define out insertion points or maybe some wrinkling. But you can also just use the standard brush with an alpha and modify that alpha to be just a little pinchier. And you'll get a little bit different result. So it won't actually pull things together. It'll kind of just push in or pull out. And by default, the lazy mouse settings on standard are kind of goofy. So lazy mouse just lets you, it's just like it sounds. You don't have to be as precise because the tracking on it will actually solve and smooth out a lot of the issues you might have. So once I get my settings kind of where I want it, I can start thinking about these secondary areas. And you can see I've upped the resolution on my Dynamesh now. I'm at 32. Still very low resolution, but it's just enough to start getting in some of these little design beats that if I needed to show something or someone just was curious, or I was curious if things are working, I can apply them very quickly. But then by smoothing it or running a clay brush or something over it, they go away really fast. And on that note, I don't really undo very often, especially at this stage. I'm going to always move forward, and whatever you're working on can very quickly become a happy accident. So if you undo a lot and have to be really precise with every mouse movement or brush movement, it's going to be a very slow process. So always try to move forward is where I try to go. So I just kind of want to block in the general idea of the mouth and face here. So I've upped the resolution a little bit. And later on, you're going to see when you're doing a character like this, you might focus on the head for a bit longer. And then when you get into the body, make a new subtool and keep it low resolution. And then you can fuse them together later on. So those are kind of the main notes in terms of what tools I'm going to be using early on for this stuff. And as other things come up, I will definitely point them out and slow the video down so we can explore those a little bit. But I guess the other note is I'm always kind of working pretty far zoomed out, and my canvas window, as you see, does not fill my screen. I did try to keep things mostly focused for this, but a couple times I think I default back to my zooming way out while I'm looking at everything. And the reason for that is I'm trying to look at this guy, whatever I'm working on, in the round. I don't want to be so focused on a little nostril detail that I forget, oh yeah, he doesn't have, the main gesture that he should have. Detailing is very fun and it's easy to lose yourself in, but it's the least important thing on a character. In fact, as we get further on, you'll see that we change detail quite a bit as we go. Sometimes in post, sometimes in the sculpt. And for this character, we're actually going to take it pretty far in 3D. If I'm roughing something out for a first pass, I might only go to about the stage that you see here and render him out, and then take him into Photoshop and just do paint overs. Really quick paint overs to kind of get the idea across and have a lot of options. But I think it'd be more interesting for this masterclass to go through the entire process of making kind of a finalized or final-ish character. And so that's kind of what we're going to be doing. We're going to take a rough idea and a rough sculpt and refine it to the point where it won't be a final VFX asset, but it will definitely be fully informative to the client, to the film. And if you had to pass it off to a costumer, if you had to pass it off to a practical effects or VFX shop, they would have a lot of their answers. I guess one other brush I use a lot is the clay brushes, and this is the clay buildup. You can see it actually builds things up. And this is just the clay brush. You can see it almost fills things in. So between the two of them, we actually can get some really nice organic shapes. One little thing I like to do on the clay buildup brush is add a little noise to this kind of noisy circle already and get this kind of lumpy looking alpha. It's just a little more organic. If you're doing something with hard surface, that square one might be great, but for organic things, you want to build up those shapes and blend them together and have them overlap. So by doing this, we are able to quickly get some interesting shapes happening and then smooth them out. This isn't texture, though. I don't want you guys to be confused by, oh, is that his skin texture? No, it's just a way of kind of building up the shapes. So then just looking for any extra, any areas that are maybe not working too well, maybe could have a secondary beat. And like I said, at about this stage, would be a pretty good time to take this and do some rough renders and bring it into Photoshop and just start solving some of the problems before spending too much time in 3D. It's very easy to kind of lose yourself in this sculpting process and have a lot of, it's very fun, but it's also, it can be a bit of a time suck. And you won't really have something great to show the end result for a lot longer. So always saving versions as you go is very important.